still remember walking out of class when I was in seminary one day, and I walked downtown Pasadena, and I walked past a secular bookstore, and these big posters up and say, read the 15 books that the early church fathers didn't want you to read. These are books that should have been in the Bible, and they were left out. Well, there's nothing surprising about it. They're called the Apocrypha, and the charge was made, well, Apocrypha means hidden, and so the early church fathers hid these books from us. And well, it does mean hidden, but we've always known about it, and in fact, these books have been in the Catholic Bible from day one. Let me tell you just a bit about the background. Basically, this is the question of why is the Protestant Bible shorter than the Catholic Bible? Starting after 400 BC, after Malachi, we started getting a series of books that were written, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Judith, Bel and the Dragon, these Esdras, these kind of books. And they weren't written in Hebrew. And they were circulated around. They're fascinating books about the history of the time and the polity of the time. They're very Jewish. And we didn't really, let's just say the Jews didn't really know what to do with them, because the Jews believed that the Spirit stopped talking with Malachi until the Messiah was going to come, and these books were all later, and they weren't, as I said, they weren't in Hebrew. And so the Jews weren't quite sure what to do with these books. The problem for Protestants is that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, includes them. And so the Bible that Paul most likely carried was this Greek Bible, had Bel and the Dragon in it. Like I said, most of it's just kind of interesting history or interesting polity. There's some theological issues, though, that cause a problem. For example, Ben Sirach says that sin had its beginning with Eve. And we know from the pastorals and Romans that Paul says that sin had its beginning with man, with Adam. And so there's some theological issues. But what do we do with these things? Well, what happened was that in the Septuagint, they were included and they were interspersed throughout, chronologically, interspersed throughout the books that we all recognize as part of the Old Testament. Judaism, somewhere around 90 AD, apparently officially said, no, these books don't belong in our canon and you can't make us read them. So the Jews never accepted the Old Testament Apocrypha books as authoritative. But again, the problem is that they're in Paul's Bible, and as you go through the early centuries of the church, you will see some hesitancy but acceptance by the early church fathers. You see church fathers saying things like, it's okay to read these, but don't derive any theology from them. Well, this even went up through Jerome, and he was doing the Latin Vulgate. He was hesitant about including them, but he went ahead and included them. And it comes up to the time of the Reformation, and that's when everything started happening, because Luther really did not like the Old Testament Apocrypha for various reasons. One is they weren't in Hebrew, and in the Enlightenment and the Reformation era, there was a real renewed interest in Hebrew. But mostly he didn't like some of the doctrines that the Catholic Church went to the Apocrypha to defend. For example, the Catholic doctrine of indulgences goes back to a verse in the Apocrypha. It's not actually what the verse says, but it was used as the basis of the doctrine of indulgences. And because Luther disliked these doctrines so much, he really didn't want to have the Old Testament Apocrypha in his Bible. So they're not written in Hebrew, not accepted by Judaism, questionable theology. So what Luther did was a very, very clever thing. He didn't just say, don't read it. But he took the 13, depending upon how you count, 15 books that were interspersed throughout other Old Testament books, and he put them in a separate section. And so you have the Old Testament, then you have the Old Testament Apocrypha, then you have the New Testament. And within about 100 years, publishers had simply dropped out that middle section, and it ceased to have an influence in Protestant thought. Now, the Catholic Church at the Council of Trent, in reaction, officially canonized the Old Testament Apocrypha about 100 years later. So even the Catholic Church had not come out with an official statement. So the Catholic Bible has books in the Old Testament that Protestants don't have, interesting books but of some questionable theology, not written in Hebrew, not accepted by Judaism, that was pulled out of the Bible and eventually dropped around the time of the Reformation. But I would encourage you just to go read some of it. I mean, again, some of it's interesting, and, well, it's interesting. But some of it you look at and you go, I don't think so. But I encourage you to pick it up and read it for yourself, and to be able to know why, as you deal with your Catholic friends, or if you are Catholic, to know why the Bibles are of different lengths.